Salwete. Welcome back, guys. Hope you are doing well. Hope you guys enjoyed the test and did well on Friday. Yesterday, I gave you a little assignment about Roman baths. I thought it'd be cool to do a little Roman culture, break things up here and there. So I might do that from time to time when I find something cool to show you guys. But I do, of course, want to move forward through Roman history. There's still a lot to learn. We've learned about one Roman emperor, and there are a lot of them, right? Now, most of them don't rule for 40 years like Augustus. In fact, some of them even rule for weeks or months. Some of them get killed early or die of weird reasons. So they definitely will not all get the Augustus treatment, but we'll go through as many emperors as we can and stop and slow down on some of the bigger ones, right? So we have a lot to cover the rest of this semester. So we're starting chapter 9 today, which is called the Early Principate, as you can see here on the screen. And next chapter, we will get into chapter 10. These next two chapters will be combined on the same test. They're a little bit smaller than the last chapter, so I thought it'd be good to have a chapter 9 and 10 test. Okay. So let's take a look. Now, I'm going to be referring back to this every once in a while. It's the Julio-Claudian family tree, and you obviously don't need to copy this down immediately. You can find this online a lot of places. But the first 5 emperors, starting with Augustus, are called the Julio-Claudians because of the two families that they hail from. So I'm going to show you this occasionally just to show where people are. Here is Julius Caesar, and here you see Augustus, his nephew, and his adopted son. And we learned about Livia, his wife, already. This next chapter, we're going to deal with the rest of the Julio-Claudian emperors, which are Tiberius, and then down to Caligula, and Claudius, and Nero. Okay, so I'll refer to back. It's kind of a complicated family tree because you have some cousins getting married and multiple marriages. People die and they get remarried. So there's a lot of complicated stuff going on with these marriages. So make sure to take good notes as we look over the notes here, and you want to be ready for the next test. You guys did well in the last one, but want to make sure we're ready for the chapters 9 and 10 tests. We definitely won't get through that this week because we have Friday off for Good Friday. I won't be posting any new assignments or anything that day. So, but we'll probably get to that sometime next week. So where do we stand at the end of the last chapter? Of course, Augustus had died, as we know, and the person taking over after Augustus was Tiberius. Basically, all the men that Augustus was hoping to have take over for him died. We had Marcellus die, we had Gaius and Lucius die, we had Agrippa die, and so the only one left really was Tiberius. And Tiberius was his stepson. He was Livia's son, if you remember, but not Augustus' actual birth son. So by this time, the emperor had become the commander-in-chief, basically, of all the armed forces. It was de facto that he had the ability to appoint most of the commanders and things like that, and had power over a lot of the provinces. It also became kind of a rule, or maybe an unwritten rule, that sometime after 19 BC, only members of the imperial family could receive a triumph from that big parade we talked about before, the big military parade. Before, that just went to worthy generals or something, but now it was more of a thing. And the idea behind that is the emperor doesn't want to give something like that to someone who might get so popular that they somehow become a threat to him or something. So triumphs after that point were not just given to other generals who were not members of the imperial family. So we talked about this last chapter, but Augustus advised Tiberius, and he actually wrote it in his will, that he recommended that Rome not try to grow too much more after his death. Because if you remember what had happened, they had kind of grown to some natural boundaries like mountains and seas and stuff like that. And Augustus thought if we keep growing, it's going to be too fast and get to places where Rome can't control itself. So he recommended that Rome, had gotten big enough or largely big enough and didn't need to keep going and conquer the entire earth. We'll see what happens with that. But of course, the boundaries shift. It's kind of cool. I'll try to post it sometime, but I saw one time on YouTube or something, kind of a quick video that goes like every year where the Roman boundaries were and how they change over time. But they don't just go out and out and out. They do, you'll have a treaty, a war is one here, they'll expand, and they lose something over here. So their boundaries are always changing year to year a little bit, sometimes big bits and sometimes little changes, but the boundaries all are always in shifting. As far as Rome's enemies at the time, of course, they had enemies in the north and down even some in Africa, but their most organized enemy and the one that gave them the most trouble was the Parthians in the east. We've seen them for decades now. The Parthians are the one they've been fighting since Caesar's time and even before that, but they're certainly Rome's most organized and persistent enemy at the time. So in order to deal with them, they tried to keep a buffer there, the king of Armenia, which they had not annexed, but they tried to keep that as like a friendly province to help them fight against the Parthians and kind of keep them off of Rome's back door. So we'll talk about the reign of the next emperor, Tiberius. We do call him the second emperor. You can see Tiberius here in the statue. You see the dates of his rule there. He took over in AD 14, whenever Augustus died. And, at that time, there was no constitution that said he would take over, but it was pretty clear when Augustus adopted Tiberius that that's what he intended. And think about it, Augustus had ruled for 40 years. For a lot of people, that's their whole lives. That's all they ever knew. And so they're going to respect what Augustus set up. And it basically was kind of a hereditary thing. Obviously, they're not blood related, but it was his family, and Augustus had basically chosen his successor. If you remember Tiberius, he was kind of an odd bird. He had not been in Rome his life. He had spent some time in Rome, but he spent a lot of time away from Rome. He had kind of gone away from Rome. He had left Rome and lived on the island of Rhodes for a number of years, maybe dissatisfied with the marriage to Julia. Maybe he didn't like the city life. We have some, different reports of why he did that, but he seemed to not be totally happy with city life. Also, he was a really good general, so he had spent many years away fighting the Germans in the north and fighting in other areas. So he wasn't a person who had been in Rome his whole life and made these connections and knew how to deal with people and play politics. He was more of a military man who had to come in and learn how to be emperor. I'm sure he'd been trained in some ways by his mother and by Augustus, but he was not someone who had been being groomed for this his entire life. Augustus hadn't planned on making him emperor until that became his only choice. He didn't have a lot of personal friends in the city. He had not had made those connections. He had not stayed there for big parts of his life. He was a somewhat isolated emperor, we would call him. He seems to be more secretive and cautious than Augustus. He kept people kind of at distance. Sometimes he looked for plots and stuff, and we'll talk about that, but he was certainly more secretive and cautious than Augustus. His relationship with the Senate over his rule, not right away, but over his rule, became a little rocky, a little bumpy. And one thing that he did that really made the senators worried and uncomfortable was treason trials. He would have treason trials if the emperor thought that there was anyone conspiring against him. But even for lesser things, treason is one thing, but even you had treason trials for libel, slander, and even adultery with a member of the imperial family. So it were offenses that people were always on the lookout for, looking over their shoulder. Is one of the emperor's informants looking out, and there became a little bit of suspicion and paranoia with senators. Now, I say paranoia, there really were these treason trials, so they weren't paranoid per se, but they had to be worried about him. Now, were some of these trials to get Tiberius' political enemies out of the way? Certainly that could be true, right? Could someone have been targeted for libel and they didn't actually say these things? Sure, it could have been. So these could have been a potential tool that he and his advisors used. He also relied heavily on the Praetorian Guard, who we know were his bodyguards and basically the patrollers in the city. But he made a change from Augustus. He built a large barracks basically on the edge of Rome, have him right on the edge of Rome. The idea is that's a threat that, if there's any kind of threats to my power or anything, my personal Praetorian Guard, who are loyal to me, are right on the edge of the city. So his relationship with the Senate was not as good because he used kind of these ways to manipulate him. All right. If I ever go too fast, sorry, I'm covering up Sejanus there. If I ever go too fast in these notes, feel free to pause your video and everything so you keep up really easily. Now, speaking of the Praetorian Guard, the leader of the Praetorian Guard was called the Praetorian Prefect, and over time this became a very, very powerful position, being in charge of basically the emperor's personal guard. And the first prominent leader that we know about, the first Praetorian Prefect that has like a big role to play, it was called Sejanus, Lucius Aelius Sejanus. He became prefect sometime by the early 20s or so, and basically Tiberius became to develop more and more trust in him, and over time it seems like he had a ton of power because Tiberius delegated a lot of things, a lot of responsibilities to him. He seems to have exploited Tiberius's trust to advance his own political career, and also he might have been, from what we understand, behind some of the treason trials that were increasing. There were also rumors, and we can't confirm these. A lot of things that happened in Roman times were rumors and hearsay, but there's certainly rumors that he had Tiberius' own son, who was called Drusus. Drusus the Younger had him killed because Sejanus thinking he might want to take over as emperor someday. He can't do that if Tiberius has a son. Again, these things aren't confirmed. These are things that would have been written down as rumors, but sometimes historians wrote down rumors. They said there were certain people who thought this, but it can't be confirmed. So unfortunately, there's some things like that, but that happens in almost every history. Now, Tiberius did something weird that Augustus never did. He again became disenchanted with the city. He didn't like living there. And as emperor, he decided to retire to an island called Capri, which was in southern Italy, kind of off the Bay of Naples. So he retired, staying emperor in 26 AD. And basically, he would send his pronouncements and decisions and rulings and instructions back to Rome, and Sejanus would carry out his instructions, right? So think about how much this increased Sejanus's power, because the emperor's not even there. He's still keeping his power, but he doesn't want to live in Rome anymore. So he's ruling for over 10 years from this island where he built this large palace for himself. Now, it seems like eventually Sejanus pushed things a little bit too far, because we do know that eventually he might have, we don't know exactly, but did he try to do some kind of coup or something against the state? Eventually Tiberius turns on Sejanus, probably because someone tells Tiberius that, hey, there's a plot against you by Sejanus. That's what we think, at least. But eventually Tiberius turns on him, and basically Tiberius comes back to Rome briefly. He doesn't actually enter the city, but he comes back, and basically he has to do a purge of Sejanus and all of Sejanus's men, because a lot of the Praetorian Guard is loyal to Sejanus. So Tiberius comes back, and there's basically Sejanus is executed. Many of his friends and associates are executed. His family members are executed. And the idea is that all of these men need to be purged for the emperor to be safe in his position. And the picture here, you might be wondering why the picture here, but this is Patrick Stewart. He's a pretty famous actor. He's still around and acting. But this is one of his first roles, was as Sejanus in an old miniseries called I, Claudius, that some of you are probably aware of. But he was the actor who played Sejanus in that role, one of his early roles. Now, after he was killed and executed by Tiberius, another prefect took over, Quintus Sertorius Macro, who was also seen to be cunning, and even may have had a role in bringing down Sejanus, knowing that he would be the one to move up into that position if Sejanus is taken out. So Augustus was someone who the people loved, for the most part, it seemed like, whereas Tiberius was never that kind of happy, cuddly emperor that the people could kind of relate to. And so he never endeared himself to the people as much as Augustus, right? He was certainly capable in some ways. I don't want to paint him like he was not good at anything. He had made some good decisions. He was certainly good militarily. He made some good things, but he certainly wasn't worried about as much what the people thought of him and wanting them to respect him. He paid less attention to monuments, building things for the people, etc. And that's something you need to do for the people, for them to like you and respect you and appreciate you. Obviously, moving to Capri was separated him further from the people of Rome and made him seem like, imagine if our president moved to, some foreign island, I guess not a foreign island, but just kind of moved to Hawaii and just said, even though that's a state, and just said, I'm never going to visit the mainland or anything. It'd be certainly a weird thing to do that. So he never returned to Rome during those periods in Capri. I mentioned that he came back to Italy during when he had to take care of the Sejanus thing, but he never returned to Rome, even for his mother's funeral. Livia ended up dying in 29 AD. He didn't return even for that. So it showed you how much he didn't want to be in the city. He was effective militarily. He was a good military commander. He sent Germanicus, who you should know about. That was his nephew, one of his potential heirs, because remember, Drusus, Tiberius' son, dies. So he sends Germanicus on a few important missions to deal with German tribes and to deal with the Parthians. But Germanicus ends up dying of some mysterious, we don't know exactly, of some mysterious illness, but he died in 19 AD, so he could not be someone who would take over for Tiberius. There was, again, whispers and rumors that he was allegedly killed by someone called Piso, potentially on, we don't think this was Tiberius's order necessarily, but maybe on someone's order. But so Germanicus may have been killed because he was healthy at the time. But again, it doesn't necessarily mean that happened, but there was rumors there. He also sent his son Drusus, of course, before Drusus died on many military campaigns. Unfortunately for him, Drusus the Younger died also in 23 AD, allegedly poisoned by Sejanus, who wanted to kind of step over him. Um, Tiberius ended up dying in AD 37. He was 77 years old, so he lived to be pretty old for that time. His death at that time, his entire reign was kind of delved more into negativity over time. So I don't make it seem like he was just a tyrant his entire, because he ruled for several decades, as you can see. But he started off to where he was somewhat engaged and making good decisions, and over time he just became less engaged and more kind of embittered. And of course, he moved to Capri, and so his reign kind of took a turn, especially the last 10 years or so. People didn't trust him. So in general, it seemed like his death was welcomed by most of the people of Rome. I mean, he's not even living here; he didn't care about us anymore. So most people in Rome seem to have appreciated his death, or they certainly didn't mind it. He may have been more popular in the provinces because of their relative peace and prosperity in the provincial regions, right? So Tiberius effective in some ways, but certainly he was no Augustus, from what we can tell. And just what we have here in the picture is Tiberius's large palace. It's still there. I mean, the remnants of it here you can see that we're on the island of Capri that you could still go visit if you ever go to the island of Capri. Now, taking over for Tiberius is going to be an emperor that we call Caligula. I want to save Caligula for tomorrow because he's quite the character and he deserves some time. You've probably heard his name, associated with certain things, but I want to give him the time he's due and everything. So tomorrow we'll deal with Caligula and some more of the Julio-Claudian emperors. And thank you guys for keeping up and doing so well with your notes and everything. And tomorrow we will hit Caligula. Remember, if you need anything from me, you should always pop into my office hours. I do those every day at 10 on Zoom. You can see instructions to visit me there. And you can also just message me or email me if anything, and I'll get back to you pretty quickly. Okay. Hope you guys are doing well. Hope you guys are keeping up with everything. And if I can do anything for you, be sure to let me know. Okay. Wale, I'll see you tomorrow.